The air inside the British embassy in Ouagadougou was sharp with tension. You could feel it before you even walked through the doors. Outside, the desert wind swept through the capital. Inside, polished shoes clicked nervously on marble floors. Something unusual was unfolding, something not seen in decades. An official letter had arrived. Stamped with the royal seal of Buckingham Palace, King Charles III had extended a formal invitation to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the head of Burkina Faso, to attend a Commonwealth History Forum in London. The letter, laced with refined diplomatic language, called it a celebration of shared history. But Traoré, read between the lines. To him, it wasn't a celebration. It was a test, a challenge, an invitation to sit at the table of empire and to stay quiet about how that empire had been built. In Western media, the reaction was immediate and condescending. On British talk shows, commentators chuckled, "Will Traoré bow to the crown? He doesn't belong in those rooms," tweeted one conservative voice in the UK. But Traoré, he didn't blink. He stepped in front of the press, calm as ever, and said only this: "If they wish to speak of history, then let us speak the whole truth." And with that, he accepted. When his plane touched down at Heathrow, the reception was cold but proper. British officials met him with the stiffness of tradition: white gloves, tight smiles, ceremonial bows. Traoré responded with a nod. No grin. No small talk. He wasn't here to perform gratitude. As his motorcade rolled through London, a quiet storm was building. Some called his visit bold. Others, dangerous. But everyone knew this wasn't going to be another polite conversation about history. Not with him. Inside Buckingham Palace, the walls whispered of conquest. Paintings of red-coated soldiers in African jungles, gold-trimmed maps with broken borders. And when Traoré finally entered the royal chamber, everything went silent. King Charles stood in royal attire, calm, composed. He extended his hand. "Captain Traoré," he said, "welcome to Britain. We've come a long way. Haven't we?" Traoré looked him square in the eye. "Yes," he replied. "Some of us walked, others stole ships." The room froze. A single camera clicked. That was the moment everyone in that palace realized Traoré hadn't come for tea. He'd come to turn the page, and he wasn't going to ask politely. Inside Buckingham Palace, time seemed to hold its breath. After Traoré's quiet jab, some of us walked. Others stole ships. No one moved. No one spoke. You could hear the chandeliers humming above. A diplomat coughed. A press camera clicked. But King Charles, he stood still. Smile frozen. "I suppose," the king said finally, "we'll be speaking frankly today." Traoré gave a slow nod. "I don't know any other way." They weren't equals in protocol. But in that moment, everyone in the room knew this wasn't the empire's stage anymore. Outside the palace, London was buzzing. Crowds had gathered, some waving Union Jacks, others holding signs that read, "Africa is not yours. Apologize for empire." The city was split, half cheering, half clenching their teeth. Inside, the round table began. Crystal glasses clinked. Silver trays floated past with tiny pastries. Oxford and Cambridge historians cleared their throats and introduced the day's topic, the legacy of empire civilization, cooperation, and conflict. King Charles took the first turn. His voice was solemn, measured, Our past, he began, is not without blemish. But through colonization came roads, schools, systems of law. We brought civilization to places of chaos. No one interrupted. Until the moderator turned slowly toward the other end of the table. Captain Traoré. Your thoughts. The room quieted. Traoré leaned forward, elbows on the polished wood. His voice wasn't loud, but it landed like thunder. You speak of civilization as if it were a gift. He said, but gifts aren't taken by force. A few attendees shifted uncomfortably. Someone dropped a pen. Traoré continued. Your empire didn't build roads for us. It built roads to take what you needed. Gold, cotton, bodies. You didn't bring law to teach justice. You brought law to teach obedience. Then he paused, looked the king in the eye. You erased our names. You outlawed our languages. And now you wear our ancestors' jewels on your crowns and call it culture. You could cut the air with a knife. One historian tried to interject, but the moderator held up a hand. No one dared speak. The king sat still. His fingers tightened just slightly on the tablecloth. Then he replied, you make strong claims, Captain, but without Britain's institutions, where would your country be today? Traoré didn't blink. Free, he said. Maybe poorer, maybe slower. To industrialize. But free? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was warlike. And in that silence, one truth echoed louder than any royal anthem. Traoré hadn't come to argue. He'd come to reclaim the mic. The roundtable was supposed to continue. It didn't. After Traoré's final word, free, the entire tone shifted. The room wasn't a forum anymore. It was a reckoning. The moderator fumbled for the next segment, trying to steer things back to collaborative dialogue. But the moment had already broken free from protocol. Outside, the crowds roared. Protesters who'd only heard whispers now shouted with clarity. A tweet went viral within minutes. Traoré didn't come to tea. He came to testify. Another read, he said it. To the king's face. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire across social media, first in Africa, then across the globe. On TikTok, a video of Traoré's stare hit 1 million views in under 2 hours. On X, his quote trended worldwide. Gifts are not taken by force. By the next morning, London was in chaos. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Burkina Faso, president's schools, the king's stolen gold. Stolen glory. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was far from poetic. King Charles stood alone in his study, reading the Times with tight lips. Camilla entered quietly, watching the storm gather behind his eyes. He embarrassed me, Charles muttered. In my own house. Camilla raised an eyebrow. Or, he simply told the truth. Charles said nothing. Instead, he pulled up the clip on his phone, Traoré's calm dismantling of centuries-old narratives. The way he didn't shout, didn't flinch, just told the story nobody wanted told. Meanwhile, back at the embassy, Traoré walked the halls of empire with quiet focus. No gloating, no speeches, just thought. His aide, Malik, approached with a tablet. You need to see this, he said. Traoré glanced down. Shirar, 4 million views. Al Jazeera, BBC Africa, even CNN. all broadcasting segments under a single headline, The Return of the Voice. In Parliament, fury erupted. One MP shouted that Traoré should apologize for disrespecting a monarch. But a Nigerian-born MP stood slowly and replied, "If telling the truth about colonial theft is disrespect, then maybe we need to rethink what we built our pride on." No one had a comeback. And at the palace, King Charles called a private meeting with his press team. He asked just one question: how do you counter a man who speaks without fear? Silence. Not one of them had an answer. The headlines hadn't cooled. They burned hotter. By day 3, the media frenzy had crossed oceans. On American news networks, Unker debated Traoré's words. On African airwaves, he was a symbol. But inside 10 Downing Street, he was a problem. The British Prime Minister placed a direct call to Buckingham Palace. His tone wasn't diplomatic. "We're losing control of the narrative." He warned, "This isn't just viral. It's turning geopolitical." Charles's reply was cold. "Perhaps narrative control is a privilege of those who were never looted." The silence on the line said it all. In Ouagadougou, Traoré didn't celebrate. Immobilised. Within 72 hours, his government announced the Gold Restoration Audit, a multinational commission to investigate colonial-era mineral extractions. Economists from Mali, legal scholars from Ghana, archivists from South Africa. Together, they were building a case. "This isn't revenge," Traoré said in a national address. "This is recovery of wealth, of memory, a voice." But London snapped back. The Daily Mail screamed, "Traoré declares economic war on Britain talk." Shows mocked his accent, his uniform, even his youth. He thinks he's Sankara with social media. One pundit laughed. Traoré didn't blink. When a Sky News reporter asked, "Are you worried this will damage your country's relationship with Britain?" he stared into the camera and said, "A relationship built on silence is not a friendship. It's obedience. And we obey no one." That quote hit like an earthquake. Inside royal halls, aides whispered about the collapse of diplomatic order. At Parliament, tempers flared. One Conservative MP shouted, "We cannot let historical revisionists destroy our legacy." But from the back row, a young MP from Birmingham stood and calmly answered, "We brought roads. Yes, we also brought chains. And maybe it's time we face that." The room went dead quiet. Behind the scenes, panic spread through Britain's top institutions. At the Royal Collection Trust, Charles sat with historians, staring at a golden catalogue of stolen artifacts. The question on the table wasn't if they were taken. It was, what would happen if we gave them back? One advisor spoke softly, "If we return it to him, others will come knocking." Charles looked out the window. The sky was gray, the wind restless. He didn't turn back. "They already are." And with that, the countdown to history had begun. The fire Traoré started was no longer just political. It was personal. Inside Windsor Castle, King Charles paced alone. The pressure wasn't just coming from governments. It was coming from inside the palace itself. He summoned his most trusted aide. His voice was tired but firm. "I need to speak with him," Charles said. With President Traoré, the king nodded. "Yes, but not on the BBC. No microphones. No press. Just man to man." The aide hesitated. "And if what he wants is something we cannot give?" Charles looked out the window. His reflection in the glass stared back at him crownless. "Then we admit it," he said quietly, "and live with the truth." The invitation was sent, not through diplomats, but with the king's own signature. A private summit. Neutral ground. No cameras. No stage. Just two men. And centuries between them. The location, a secluded estate in Geneva. Snow fell softly as King Charles arrived first. Flanked by no one. No royal garments. No crown. Just silence. Then Traoré walked in. No medals. No guards. Just a folded notebook in his hand. They didn't shake hands. They didn't smile. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Charles broke the ice. "I wanted to see the man," he said slowly, "who calls my country a thief." Traoré didn't flinch. "Your country didn't just steal," he said. "It built an empire with what it stole." The words didn't echo. They landed heavy. Charles Sahil. "You know, I grew up surrounded by maps, portraits of explorers. They called it glory. They never mentioned the blood." Traoré stepped closer. "And now that the blood is screaming from the soil, you want to talk." Charles turned toward the window. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Traoré placed the notebook on the table. "Not money. Not scripted apologies. I want acknowledgement. From your lips. Before the world." Charles narrowed his eyes. "You want me to dismantle Britain's self-image in a single sentence?" "No," Traoré said. "I want you to tell the truth and let the world decide what to do with it." There was a long pause. Then the king whispered, "You'll destroy me." Traoré's voice didn't waver. "Not you. The myth." And in that silence, a wall cracked. A throne wavered. And a reckoning stepped through. The decision was made behind stone walls and falling snow. No press leaks. No palace whispers. No royal spin. Just two men. One descendant of kings. One soldier from a forgotten colony. And a choice that would change everything. King Charles returned to London. Changed. There were no parades. No royal statements. Only silence. The kind that comes before a storm. And then, the palace issued a single press release. A public address would be made. By King Charles. Standing beside President Ibrahim Traoré. No thrones. No national anthems. No ceremony. Just two podiums. One bearing the royal seal. The other blank. The world held its breath. On the day of the broadcast, screens lit up from Accra to Auckland. From Southside Chicago to Soweto. From classrooms in Delhi to kitchens in Kingston. People didn't scroll. They stared. And then, the king stepped forward. "My name," he began slowly, "is Charles. I am a descendant of kings who ruled over a global empire. An empire built not only on ships and trade, but on conquest, coercion, and exploitation." Gasps echoed through drawing rooms, dormitories, and debate halls. But Charles didn't stop. For generations, he continued, Britain extracted wealth from lands it did not own. We took gold. We took labor. We took names. And too often, we gave back silence. He paused, then glanced to his right. To Traoré, standing tall, arms folded, silent. Charles spoke again. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso reminded all of us that truth delayed is justice denied. Still, Traoré said nothing. He didn't have to. The king was unraveling centuries with each word. I cannot change the past, Charles said, but I can acknowledge it. And I do. Britain stole. And it's time we start giving something back. The moment landed like thunder in the soul of the world. In Brazil, elders wept. In Johannesburg, students danced on campus lawns. In London, some called it courage. Others called it betrayal. But Traoré, he simply turned to Charles, extended his hand, and whispered, "You just reclaimed your own humanity." The two men stood side by side. A king without a crown, a soldier without fear. And in that instant, a photograph was taken. It became the image shared in every corner of the earth. A hand extended across history. A truth no longer buried. The myth had broken, and the world was watching what came next. The speech was over, but the fire had only just begun. Inside Buckingham Palace, the royal court was in uproar. Advisors scrambled. Phones buzzed. Whispers turned to panic. What was he thinking? One lord hissed. He admitted theft on global television. Some wanted Charles declared unfit. Others whispered the word abdication for the first time in a generation. Across the city, Parliament wasn't calmer. An emergency session was called. Some MPs called Charles unstable. Others praised him. It's the first time this monarchy's had a conscience. One said, and the chamber split down the middle, history cracking in real time. But the fallout didn't stop in London. In Washington, a White House aide muttered, he just handed Russia and China a soft power victory on a silver platter. In Paris and Brussels, foreign ministries fumed. If Britain starts returning gold, what will France be asked? What will Belgium owe? But while governments panicked, the people moved. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's words became more than a speech. They became a movement. Across West Africa, murals of the handshake appeared overnight. T-shirts bore the words, "This is our gold." At schools, kids reenacted the summit. At universities, debates exploded. What else must be returned? Then came the next strike. Traoré announced the Justice Archive Project, a Pan-African alliance to research colonial exploitation and demand reparations backed by data, law, and history. Leaders from Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, all joined in. Some European officials laughed it off symbolic. They said, until a memo leaked from the British Museum. It was marked urgent. Inside panic over looming requests to return looted artifacts. Among the list, the Benin bronzes, the Asante gold, manuscripts taken from Timbuktu, and not a single threat had been made. Traoré never raised his voice. He never demanded. He just told the truth. And now, institutions across Europe were bracing for a tide they could no longer hold back. A soldier from Ouagadougou had become a mirror not just for Britain, but for every nation that once called itself empire. The reckoning had started, and it wasn't loud. It was precise. It was relentless, and it was coming. The world had watched the speech. Now it was watching the response. And what came next? No one was ready for. The invitation was sent quietly. Not through press releases, not through embassies, but with handwritten notes. One from King Charles. One from President Ibrahim Traoré. A repatriation ceremony. No palaces. No pomp. Just sacred ground and stolen history ready to come home. The location Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. under a sky streaked with gold. World leaders arrived in silence, not to pose, not to lecture, but to witness. A long table stood at the center. On it, wrapped in velvet, protected by glass, were the first of many golden staffs. Ceremonial masks, scrolls bound in silk, and a carved lion figurine taken in 1896 during a colonial raid. Charles stood on one side, Traoré on the other. No bodyguards, no walls, no crown. The crowd was hushed. A breeze lifted the edges of the velvet cloth. Then Charles stepped forward. "We do this," he said, "not to erase the past, but to stop hiding behind it." Then Traoré stepped beside him. He picked up the lion figurine gently, held it in both hands. "This," he said, voice low, "was not a gift. It was a wound. But today, we begin to close it." The crowd didn't erupt. There was no applause, only silence. Heavy, sacred, like a continent exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. The ceremony was broadcast live in over 50 countries. In homes across Africa, tears flowed. In the Caribbean, church bells rang. In Aboriginal communities in Australia, fires were lit in remembrance. But in London, in Paris, in Brussels, there was something else. Unease, because if Britain could return what it stole, who's next? But Traoré never said a word about that. He didn't have to. The seed had been planted. The reckoning was alive. And, in the days that followed, the wave began. The Netherlands returned looted art to Indonesia. Germany offered reparations for genocide in Namibia. France faced protests outside its museums. Belgium braced for a reckoning decades overdue. Back in Ouagadougou, a new museum opened, the Hall of Return. Inside, artifacts once scattered across empires now stood proudly on Burkinabe soil. One morning, as Traoré walked its halls, a little girl stopped him. She held a school notebook, pages filled with hand-drawn African heroes. "Are you a king too?" she asked softly. Traoré knelt beside her, smiling. "No," he said. "I'm just someone who refused to forget." And outside, across the capital, a banner stretched from one rooftop to another. "We were never silent. The world just wasn't listening. Now they are." The moment didn't come with fireworks. It came with silence. And in that silence, history breathed. A long-awaited repatriation ceremony had been arranged not in London, not in Paris, but in Dar es Salaam, where the sun kissed the sea and the past could finally meet the present on neutral ground. There were no royal carriages, no orchestras, just a single wooden table. And on it, what had once been stolen: a golden staff, a lion carved from ebony, a ceremonial mask once worn by a warrior before battle, displayed for decades in glass, labeled unknown origin. Now, its origin had a face. Ibrahim Traoré stood across from King Charles, neither flanked by guards nor drowning in titles. Just two men, two stories, one wound. The world watched. Cameras streamed live to over 60 countries. From Nairobi Cafe to Brooklyn classrooms, from Lagos town squares to Aboriginal communities in the outback, everyone was watching. Charles went first. "We return these not out of pity, but out of principle," he said. "We cannot undo what was done." but we can stop pretending it wasn't. Traoré stepped forward. He picked up the lion figurine. This, he said softly, was taken in 1891. For 128 years. It was called British art. But it was never yours. It was memory. It was identity. And today it comes home. The crowd didn't cheer. They couldn't. The moment was too sacred for sound. In Ghana, bells rang. In Jamaica, elders wept. In Burkina Faso, children gathered around TVs in schoolyards, watching a lion return to its land. And then came the photo. Traoré and Charles, standing side by side. No throne, no curtain, no power games. A soldier and a monarch, sharing the weight of a truth too long buried. That image circled the world in seconds. One tweet read, "This isn't history. This is healing." But not everyone welcomed it. In European capitals, nervous governments called emergency sessions. In museum basements, curators stared at crates with shaking hands. Because if Britain could give it back, what excuse did they have? But Traoré didn't threaten. He didn't shame. He just led. And that was more powerful than any demand. The next day, as he returned home, a young girl waved to him from a crowd. "Are you our king now?" she asked. Traoré smiled. "No," he said. "I'm just someone who refused to let silence win." And for the first time in a very long time, silence lost. They called it a ceremony, but it felt more like a funeral. Not for a person, but for a lie. The repatriation had begun. Artifacts that once stood in palaces now stood under open African skies. No longer trophies. No longer behind glass. They were home. But even as the dust settled in Dar es Salaam, the aftershocks kept coming. In Brussels, curators whispered about crates, marked, "Not for display." In Paris, protesters stood outside the Louvre, chanting, "It's not art if it was stolen." And in Berlin, a headline asked the question everyone feared. If they return everything, what's left? But in Burkina Faso, something else was happening. Something bigger than revenge. Something deeper than diplomacy. A new museum opened its doors in the capital, the Hall of Return. Inside stood the lion figurine, now surrounded by children, elders, families, no velvet rope, no silent guards. And in the center of the room stood Traoré. No cameras, no suit, just him. He walked slowly through the exhibit, stopping at each artifact, not as a president, but as a son of the soil. A teacher guided a group of students through the halls. One little girl, maybe 8 years old, tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. President," she asked shyly, "were we really never free?" He knelt beside her. "We were always free," he said. "They just covered our voices with noise." Outside the museum, a new mural was painted overnight. A king without a crown. A soldier without fear. A child holding the future. The caption read, "We were never silent. The world just wasn't listening." And now, it was. In South Africa, a movement called Number, We Remember. Everything went viral. In the Caribbean, governments filed official requests for reparations. And in Australia, indigenous elders demanded the return of sacred bones. But Traoré, he didn't gloat. He didn't spike the ball. He simply stood steady like a mountain that had always been there, waiting for the fog to lift. Later that year, as the United Nations held its annual summit, Traoré was asked to speak. He didn't bring charts. He didn't bring blame. He brought a single sentence: history is not a museum. It breathes. It bleeds. And now, finally, it remembers. And with that, the room stood still. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't come from bullets or banners. They come from the courage to say what everyone else was too afraid to say out loud.